This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. An Anarchist in the City of Light. Paris, 1871. Louise Michel had always liked the smell of gunpowder. The sulfur and the metal seemed to burn away hesitation, leaving only cold, hard reality. Maybe that's why she didn't flinch when she felt the bayonet against her cheek. The steel felt oddly warm compared with the morning fog that hung heavy on the streets of Montmartre. The bedraggled soldiers in front of Michel did not inspire fear, but pity. Sallow faces beneath torn gray caps and faded blue tunics that hung low on their gaunt, emaciated bodies. These men too have known hunger, she thought. No one comes into the world with a knife in his hand. But her pity did not dampen her resolve. They had come like thieves in the night to take the people's cannons, paid for house by house, franc by franc, an insult too great to ignore. Michel's eyes moved down the rifle's barrel and up to the soldier's eyes. Fear and hesitation. Clearly gunpowder did not have the same effect on this poor man. Fire! The officer's shout snapped her back. She stayed still. No shots came. Again, fire! Still nothing. Only a tear welling in the soldier's eye. A third time, fire. As the call echoed across the cobblestones, Michel began to hear footsteps behind her. It was the women of Montmartre, nurses, seamstresses, mothers. They stepped forward, placing themselves before the cannon mouths, eyes fixed on the line of men. Then they spoke. Nothing profound, nothing aggressive. Just human words to break the cold. Slowly, the mood shifted. Boots scuffed uneasily, and a hesitant laugh broke down the line. Finally, one by one, rifle butts began tilting into the air. As the bayonet left her cheek and swung to the ground, Michel reached into her coat. She climbed onto the cannon, raised her arms, and a crimson flag tore through the fog. Mothers, soldiers, nurses, and guardsmen closed in around the captured guns, forming a ring of defiance, while the remaining loyalists slipped away into the pale morning, their bayonets glinting red in the spring sun. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is What is Socialism? A great critique of capitalism. Louise Michel is often remembered as an anarchist, a feminist, a revolutionary, and if you scroll through her biography today, you might even see the label libertarian. But in that moment in Paris in 1871, as she helped create a short-lived insurrectionary commune, she called herself a socialist. To Michel, socialism was not an abstract theory or a rigid dogma. It was a conviction that the wealth of Paris belonged to the people who worked its factories, paved its streets, and defended its cannons, not to the financiers, generals, or politicians who claimed to speak on their behalf. Long before Lenin and the Bolsheviks built the first communist state, generations of reformers, workers, philosophers, and revolutionaries had already fought, organized, and died for a more humane world under capitalism. These early disciples found each other in workshops, unions, strike committees, reading groups, and political clubs, a loose web of activists living in a world aggressively hostile to their dreams of liberation and bound by one radical belief: that the economy should serve the people, not the rich. Before we go any further, we need to ask a simple question. What even is socialism? And the short answer is that socialism is the great critique of capitalism. The long answer is that socialism has meant wildly different things to different people in different times facing different struggles. It is not a fixed doctrine. It lives, it mutates, it collides with history. What socialism meant to a Parisian communard in 1871 is not what it meant to a Cuban guerrilla in the 1950s or a Soviet bureaucrat in 1989. But we still do need a working definition. So, at its simplest, socialism is capitalism's antithesis. It asks a very old question within a new industrial world. What if the economy existed to serve people instead of profit? What if we measured freedom not just by rights, but by whether people have food, shelter, and dignity? But socialism's critique does not stop at capitalism. Capitalism first arrived wrapped in promises of liberty and progress, what Europe called liberalism, and it was enforced across the world through empire. So for many early socialists, exploitation was not just the factory floor. It was the state that sanctioned it, the church that blessed it, and the empire that turned it into policy. Of course, that broad definition makes socialism a very big tent. It includes competing visions and furious disagreements. That's why terms like communism, anarchism, and Marxism often get bundled together. And it explains how Louis Michel could be an anarchist, a feminist, libertarian, and a socialist, even though these visions of liberation have often collided, at times violently, over what freedom demands and who is willing to die for it. Think of socialism as a backyard left untended. You've got ivy, monkey grass, bamboo, plants you never asked for growing in every direction. Some coexist, others choke saplings until they die. A weed might become a tree overnight, while something delicate blooms in the shade for reasons you can't quite explain. The soil underneath it all is the same. It's the great critique of capitalism. But from that soil grew anarcho-syndicalism, libertarian communism, Leninism, Maoism, mutualism, each one a species fighting for light, space, and survival. That's socialism, not a doctrine, but an ecosystem, alive, unruly, and always trying to decide what deserves to flourish and what must be torn out by the roots. Now, revolutionary ecosystems do not grow in peace. They grow in disturbed ground, born of trauma, hunger, and injustice. Socialism emerged in crisis, not in monasteries or lecture halls, but in the factories of the early industrial world. 12-hour shifts, the shriek of iron, coal dust in children's lungs. Tenements where whole families slept on one mattress. Broken hands fed into machines because hunger was worse than pain. Early capitalism did not promise prosperity. It promised survival in a world of traumatic change. As the new industrial cities swelled, peasants were driven off their land, craftsmen were crushed by mechanization, and former villagers became wage workers overnight. They were told that freedom lived in the wage. They discovered it meant starving more slowly. Out of that world came the first socialists. They did not begin with theory, they began with outrage. Socialists came to believe that the engines of modern life, the factories, the mines, the railroads, belonged to the people who kept them running, not the investors who had never stepped inside them. Only later did this conviction harden into principles. And that, in broad strokes, is what most socialists mean when they say socialism. A more equal society built on solidarity, where democracy reaches into the economy itself, and where the key resources that keep people alive are held in common rather than owned by a few. When they first emerged, these were not abstract values, they were survival strategies. By the early 19th century, cities across Western Europe had begun to transform. Starting in London and then spreading across the continent through the German lands, France, the Netherlands, and beyond, factories roared to life, belching great plumes of smoke into the air and dumping industrial waste into the rivers. Cities swelled with displaced workers, many of them former rural peasants or town artisans, drawn into the new industrial order. This period of early capitalist development was defined by grueling working conditions. Long hours, starvation wages, rampant disease, industrial injury, child labor, urban overcrowding, and widespread social misery for the working classes. In the face of this rapid upheaval, Europe confronted a new dilemma, what would come to be called the social question, a crisis of poverty, inequality, and social dislocation that was impossible to ignore. Intellectuals from across the political spectrum each had their own diagnosis and prescription. Conservatives saw a breakdown of moral values and called for a return to traditional feudal hierarchies. Liberals pushed for an unfettered free market that would lift all boats, while socialists saw something else, a system in crisis that demanded not simply reform, but radical structural transformation. When it first emerged, socialism was not a dogmatic program, but rather a living social movement. a loose-knit network of reformers, revolutionaries, philosophers, economists, and activists who wanted to see early industrial society remade. They argued, wrote, marched, organized, and sometimes fought for a more humane and equitable world free from domination. The term socialism initially emerged as a counterpoint to liberal ideas that placed the autonomous individual at the center of social and economic life. Socialism's response to the growing emphasis on individualism in liberal capitalist thought is where the social of socialism originally came from. In response to the idealized individual so common in liberal thought, early socialists emphasized the importance of community, cooperation, and mutual aid, and critiqued the ways in which capitalism threatened these modes of social engagement. So this is the context in which the word socialism first began to appear, in journals, in radical clubs, in factories, first as a whisper, then as a major challenge to the political status quo. The most important organization to coalesce within this first generation was the International Workingmen's Association, better known as the First International. It was not only the first robust attempt to create an international socialist movement, but also one of the first groups in history explicitly committed to internationalism and cross-border cooperation. As an international organization broadly representing the interests of the industrial working class, the First International brought together a very diverse group of individuals from across Europe who held a variety of different beliefs. This diversity often led to bitter infighting over goals and methods, and such debates eventually brought to the surface one of socialism's deepest and most enduring conflicts: the question of the state. Should the state be used to transform society, or should the state itself be abolished in order to transform society? This debate led to the famous split between the red and the black, between Marxism and anarchism. And it was here that Karl Marx began to rise in prominence. Many thinkers shaped socialism in this era, but none cast a longer shadow than Marx. He believed that the state, if seized by the working class, could become a tool of transformation. That stance put him in direct opposition to anarchist and libertarian socialists like Mikhail Bakunin and the followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Their dispute over the state eventually tore the First International apart, leading to its dissolution by 1876. When the Second International was founded in 1889, anarchists were largely excluded, and even though he was long dead, Marx's influence then became decisive. Across Europe, socialist parties surged in popularity, and the Second International brought them together. The largest and most influential was Germany's Social Democratic Party, SPD, which was broadly committed to Marxism. Through the SPD's influence, Marx's ideas came to predominate. By way of Marx's distinctive theories of history and economics, the Second International embraced both reform and revolution. Marx had argued that the winning of political reforms through working-class organizing was essential in building the solidarity and consciousness necessary for a future revolution. This theoretical resolution of the reform versus revolution divide gave his ideas enduring appeal, and socialist candidates with Marxist leanings began winning elections in France, Germany, and the UK. But then World War I would shatter this fragile unity. When war came, nearly all of the major socialist parties abandoned their pledges to international peace and declared loyalty to their own nations. Former comrades became national enemies. Amidst this crisis, a previously obscure socialist faction way over in Russia seized the moment. In 1917, revolutionaries in Petrograd, armed with a fiercely specific interpretation of socialism, overthrew a provisional government and proclaimed the world's first state built explicitly on socialist principles. The Soviet Union and the Bolsheviks who led it changed the course of socialism forever. No longer was socialism simply an oppositional movement speaking from the streets, the picket line, or the party congress. It was now the governing framework of one of the world's largest empires. And in this new reality, socialists everywhere faced a stark choice. join the Soviet project and wield its immense institutional power, or reject it and remain in the perilous position of the permanent opposition. It was a choice that split friendships, broke movements, and, at times, decided who lived and who died. And nowhere did that divide feel more immediate than in Spain in the 1930s, when a young English writer arrived in Barcelona, eager to fight fascism, only to find himself caught in a very different kind of battle. Interlude: Meeting Big Brother. Barcelona, 1937. The Spanish War turned the scale, and thereafter I knew where I stood. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it. George Orwell, Why I Write. Memory had a way of changing. George Orwell had always known that. It wasn't that he had forgotten the barricades or the crack of rifles down Las Ramblas, but that the more he learned about the forces moving in the shadows, the more those memories shifted in meaning. The smell of Barcelona at least remained clear: stale tobacco smoke, frying oil from the cafes, and the faint tang of gunpowder that seemed to linger in the streets long after a firefight. But a melancholic haze now saturated his memories of Spain, a bitter sadness he knew had grown only after he had left. Upon his return to England, George felt urgently compelled to document his experiences before his memory was fully lost to the chimera of time. May the 3rd, 1937. That much at least was clear. Hundreds of police in the pay of the Spanish Republic marched on the Telefonica building. Inside were workers from the CNT, their anarchist allies in the FAI, and a few non-Soviet Marxists from the POUM, people Orwell had come to know well. A shot rang out. No one could say from where. Then came shouts, the rush of boots on stone, and the smell of spent cartridges drifting from the windows. News of the confrontation then spread like wildfire. By afternoon, Plaza Catalunya was choked with shouting crowds. Orwell could still see the overturned tram cars and crumbling cobblestones pried up for barricades. He could still hear the sniper fire whizzing over his head as he ducked through the streets. By nightfall, the city had split into two competing factions, each side claiming the revolution, each certain the other had betrayed it. Following the May days, everything changed in Barcelona. Over the previous year, Republicans, communists, anarchists, and syndicalists had fought side by side against General Franco and his fascist army. But as the Republicans and their Soviet allies consolidated their control over the city, a divide began to emerge. George had first noticed how the POUM posters that once covered the walls were suddenly gone, replaced by solemn portraits of Soviet leaders. Then, friends began to whisper about the danger of being seen with the wrong people. Orwell understood the logic. Franco had Hitler and Mussolini. The democracies had abandoned Spain, and only the Soviets would send arms. But understanding did nothing to blunt the bitterness. George's party, the POUM, were not anarchists, yet they had fought alongside them. On the front, in the streets, it hadn't mattered who carried which theory in their heads. Everyone bled the same. That's why, in Orwell's mind, the breaking of the alliance had ultimately come from above. The newspapers told another story, one that painted the May Days as an anarchist revolt. But he could not make that square with what he had seen. Whatever else was true, he knew who had tried to take the Telefonica, and he knew that his friends had been thrown in jail without trial. When Orwell first arrived in Barcelona, he had come to fight fascists, but the city had made him believe in the revolution. The solidarity he witnessed was real. Equal pay for soldiers regardless of rank, women fighting alongside men, food and clothing shared even in scarcity. It was not utopia, but it was something new, something profound. Writing about it now, he struggled to describe it. The most he could say was that it was something in the way people looked at each other, something in their eyes, a trust he had never witnessed before and would never witness again. Whatever it was, George had come to feel by the end that it was something worth defending. He sometimes wondered if that feeling could have survived peace. Would the people of Barcelona have turned on each other anyway? He never found the answer. All he knew was that for a brief moment it had been real, and that memory, formed before the May Days, was the one he chose to keep. The Spanish Civil War is often remembered as the last great cause, a brief moment of moral clarity when volunteers from across the world flocked to Spain to fight fascism. George Orwell was one of these volunteers. He came to Barcelona and joined the POUM militia, fighting on the Aragon front and later in the streets of the city itself. Many others joined the International Brigades, volunteers of every language, race, gender, and profession, bound together by the belief that a new world could be built from below. Together, these militias and brigades embodied a modern, cosmopolitan, and internationalist vision of the future, crossing borders in ways few had ever seen before. In Barcelona, Orwell saw a revolutionary experiment in motion. A city run by a coalition of trade unions, workers' cooperatives, militias, and federations. Cafes, factories, farms, and even trams were collectively managed. The revolution lived in the open air. But that autonomy became a threat. The Soviet-aligned communists, backed by the Republican government, moved to crush the city's decentralized experiment. And then the May Days broke everything. The Telefonica building on La Rambla became the symbol. Not a communications hub, but a besieged fortress. There, socialist turned gun on socialist. The top-down model of Stalin's socialism triumphed over the bottom-up revolution taking shape in Barcelona. Following the May Days, the supporters of this alternative vision for the future of Spain were repressed, many imprisoned without trial or deported. George Orwell, like many others, left Spain with a bitter lesson. The revolutions could be lost not only to their enemies, but also through betrayal from within. In Barcelona, he had seen this fragile coalition of volunteers and workers, unions and left-wing parties, Marxist, anarchist, socialist, and Republican, turn their guns on each other. As the Republican leadership drew closer to the Soviet Union, Stalin's totalitarian brand of socialism began to dominate. Those who resisted, anarchists, syndicalists, anti-Stalinist Marxists, were branded counter-revolutionary or Trotskyist and repressed. The unity that had once inspired the world was broken from above, crippling the war effort and clearing the path for Franco's fascist dictatorship by 1939. So, Spain was remembered as the last great cause because it was the last moment when the left stood together with such hope, and the last time that hope shattered so fatally. The solidarity of the early war, the betrayal of the May Days, the rewriting of history in the headlines, these would all stay with Orwell for the rest of his life. And all across Europe, others saw Spain fall and drew the same conclusion. In an age of rising dictatorships, unity on the left was fragile, and once it broke, the cost was fatal. The fallout would reshape the 20th century, and during World War II and the Cold War, the meaning of socialism shifted. Fascism met socialism with unprecedented brutality, with executions, imprisonment, and the machinery of mass death. The Second World War forced a zero-sum choice, and many socialist parties aligned themselves with the Soviet Union simply to survive. After the Allied defeat of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and their partners, socialism in the West remained closely linked in the public mind to the Soviet system, and so came under deep repression. In the United States, that association fueled McCarthyism and the Red Scare, repressive campaigns that permanently weakened the socialist left. Yet while socialism was being driven to the margins in the West, it found fertile ground in the global South and across East Asia, where it became bound up with struggles for independence and against empire. The Cold War would see socialist movements rise on every continent. In China, where peasant communism challenged Soviet supremacy. In Korea and Vietnam, where land reform and anti-colonial struggle drew in superpower intervention. In Greece and Yugoslavia, where guerrilla movements struggled under the shadow of Moscow. And in Cuba, where a socialist revolution succeeded just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. But anti-communism did not stop at America's borders. The CIA and KGB waged a hidden war for influence, funding parties, training militias, spreading propaganda, and sometimes orchestrating coups. Socialist movements that sought independence from both blocs often found themselves targeted anyway. No case captured this more than Chile. In 1970, Chileans elected a democratic socialist, Salvador Allende, in one of Latin America's most stable democracies. For 3 years, his government tried to chart a peaceful road to socialism, neither in Washington's nor Moscow's orbit. But then, in 1973, he was overthrown in a right-wing coup backed by the CIA. And so, the dream of democratic socialism in Chile ended in fire and rubble at the presidential palace. Interlude: Allende doesn't surrender. Santiago, 1973. A quote from President Richard Nixon in an Oval Office meeting with CIA Director Richard Helms on Chile, 12 days after President Allende's election. 1 in 10 chance, perhaps, but save Chile. Not concern risks involved. No involvement of embassy. $10 million available, more if necessary. Full-time job, best men we have. Make the economy scream. You should go, the president said, his voice low but steady. No one else needs to die on my behalf. Outside, the rattle of submachine guns crackled through the palace walls. Dust sifted down from the ceiling like muddied snowflakes, turning Salvador Allende's black hair a dirty gray. The man across from him shook his head, sweat and grime clinging to his tightened jaw. His patience had finally snapped after hearing this same plea all morning. With all due respect, compañero presidente, we're not here to die for you. If we die for the people, for the workers, for Chile. Allende's dark eyes stared from behind thick horn-rimmed glasses, stern yet full of weariness. He said nothing for a long moment. Have you thought any more about my offer? The man pressed. The floor shook with the thunder of a mortar blast. Allende's left hand tightened around his rubber gas mask, its dangling straps trembling. You know the answer, Carlos. I'd rather die than crawl out of here like a coward. I am no traitor. Carlos rubbed his balding forehead in exasperation, then slowly turned away. He bent over the radio, adjusting the dials with quick, nervous fingers. If you refuse, then at least let your words live on. Allende regarded the radio in silence. Then, with care, he slipped the canvas strap from his shoulder and laid his AK-47 onto the table. Its engraved plate flashed. To my friend and comrade in arms, Fidel Castro. The room hushed. Outside, the staccato of gunfire echoed through the courtyard. Allende, steel helmet still on his head, leaned toward the microphone. His voice, calm and firm, carried across the static airwaves. Workers of my country, I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Other people will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. A window shattered in the distance. Shouts rang out in the courtyard. Keep in mind that much sooner than later, the great avenues will again be opened through which will pass free people to construct a better society. Long live Chile. Long live the people. Long live the workers. When the words faded, there was no roar of a crowd, no flash of cameras. Only the buzz of the transmitter, the acrid smoke creeping through the palace halls, and the pounding of artillery outside. After his speech, Allende gathered the remaining defenders in Independence Hall. One by one, he took their hands, thanked them for their loyalty, and ordered them to surrender, hoping even then to spare their lives. For a moment, he lingered in the doorway, upright, unbowed, framed by the quivering light of a burning palace. His tweed jacket and wool sweater hung heavy with dust. He looked like a figure from another age, an age of heroes, martyrs, and traitors. Then, without a word, Salvador Allende turned and crossed the threshold alone. On September the 11th, 1973, the government of Salvador Allende was overthrown in a military coup that installed the right-wing dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. In the years that followed, Pinochet unleashed a brutal campaign of political repression. Several thousand were executed or disappeared. Tens of thousands more were tortured. Nearly 80,000 people passed through prisons and internment camps. From the beginning, Pinochet enjoyed the backing of the United States. Washington provided political cover, military aid, and financial support, not only to topple Allende, but to sustain the dictatorship that replaced him. In the decades that followed, Pinochet became a central figure in a continent-wide campaign of terror against leftists. Known as Operation Condor, it was coordinated across borders and quietly supported by the U.S. Economically, Chile became the laboratory of the so-called Chicago Boys, a group of economists trained under Milton Friedman who pursued an unyielding faith in free market capitalism. Chile's state industries were sold off, trade unions were crushed, tariffs dismantled, and social protections gutted. In the short term, the GDP grew, but inequality soared, poverty deepened, and by the early 1980s, Chile was in the midst of a devastating economic crisis, with unemployment nearing 25%. Pinochet and his inner circle enriched themselves all the while through embezzlement, tax fraud, and corruption. The result was a caricature of the neoliberal order the U.S. would champion across Latin America and eventually the world. Privatization coupled with authoritarianism, economic growth coupled with staggering inequality, and freedom for markets alongside repression for people. This model, first tested in Chile, spread outward as a template. When the Soviet bloc collapsed in 1989, this spread only accelerated. Triumphalism swept the West. Many declared that socialism had been defeated, that it belonged to another age. But then another turning point came in 2008, when markets across the world collapsed in what became the greatest global economic crisis since the Great Depression, a crisis that would crack capitalism's legitimacy. The 2008 crash and the Great Recession that followed reinvigorated critiques of capitalism. Grassroots movements began to percolate, and the most dramatic confrontation came in the center of global finance, as hundreds of thousands of demonstrators occupied Wall Street to protest inequality and austerity. And so, like a rose forcing its way through rubble, socialism began to grow once more. Fragile, contested, but undeniable. In our first season of Ism, on the origins of socialism, we will begin in Paris, the radical city. We'll enter 3 revolutions, 1793, 1848, and 1871. Moments when the promise of equality pressed against empire, capitalism, and liberal reform. When barricades and ideas rose together. When socialism first learned to bleed. And then we will go to Chicago, 1886, where anarchists and workers fought for the 8-hour day and paid for it at the gallows. Then Petrograd, 1917, where the Bolsheviks seized power and reshaped the fate of socialism forever. And we'll follow those fractures outward to Berlin in 1919 and Barcelona in 1937, places where the left turned on itself in the shadow of fascism and Stalinism. Some episodes take us directly to the streets, the gunfire, the speeches, the hunger. Others step back to ask the essential questions. What is Jacobinism? What is internationalism? Why did Marx and Bakunin split? How does an idea become a movement? And when does a movement devour its own? Ideas do not float above us. They're made by people. And I am not here to hand you conclusions. I'm here to walk the streets where people fought for their futures, and to ask why these people believed the world could be different. Words like socialism, fascism, anarchism, and liberalism did not fall from the sky. They were forged by people who risked everything to define what freedom meant. So this is Ism, and thank you so much for being here. In our next episode, Paris, 1793, the radical city, will step into the revolution's first furnace and watch the age of modern ideology ignite.
Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps des séries où l'on s'en vêtait, puis mon rêve du pendant de cerise d'hermone, et rose pareil, du bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps de série.
Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the Ism Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.